So starting off with Robert. Robert grew up on a family farm, which was a prime lamb and wool producing business. And are you seeing my screen share there, everyone? I just want to double check before I go any further. Fabulous. Robert grew up on a family farm, a prime lamb and wool producing business before his career continued to intertwine with sheep. He grew up spending years in wool sheds as a shearer and a wool classer before becoming a district wool manager and providing advice across sheep producers on breeding, productivity, harvesting, wool preparation, marketing and sales. Robert is the Managing Director of Mikado, which is Australia's leading multi-commodity risk management advisory and market intelligence service. And they're providing a whole lot of information, analysis and reporting across the agricultural spectrum. So Robert has seen the decline in the sheep flock since the 1990s, which has coincided with the corresponding increase in planted crop area. So today he's going to talk to us about this challenge. He's going to talk to us about the fight for acres and how it's been well and truly won by the grain industry. But more importantly, what's the impact that it has on farmers and the impact on the sheep industry? So we'll hear about some of the missed opportunities in the sheep industry that have restricted growth, and most importantly, the importance of embracing innovation so that we can all work towards solutions. So get ready for some big thinking as Robert gets his slides ready. And then we're going to discover what the benefits we can all gain from moving the sheep industry towards the cutting edge of agriculture. So please put your hands together for a big warm welcome to Robert Herrmann.
Thanks for the introduction. What Melissa's really saying is that I've been around for a long time and my whole life has been involved around sheep, for which I'm eternally grateful for. It has got to be the most fortunate thing that's happened to me because this is an industry that is quite unique in the world. In Australia, we tend to think that we're a big player, but in world commodities, whether we're talking about wool or sheep meat, we're a small player as an industry. However, we have the industry in Australia, and I now know globally, is made up of passionate people who just love sheep. And there's a very good reason for that. It's important. It's a very important industry to Australia, and it's also a key player in many parts of the world. And I think something that we will see coming forward is that it will increasingly play a key role in the sustainability of agriculture. Livestock are an absolutely vital ingredient in the sustainability of agriculture, and sheep will play a part. And especially in Australia, where we are predominantly made up of merino sheep, and merino sheep were originally designed to produce wool, but also to be a dual-purpose sheep and produce meat. And they were designed to meet the unique conditions of Australia, so the very special climate and seasonal conditions we have, and they do that very well. That said, and Melissa made the point, I was here in this industry when there was 165 million sheep in Australia, and now I'm in an industry where there's less than 70 million sheep. So notwithstanding my passion for the industry and everybody and the other passionate people, it has a lot of challenges, and it has a lot of things to consider and deal with into the future. But what I want to do first of all is talk about why this opportunity is so vital for Australia, and why this opportunity to build and have a sustainable sheep industry is so important. And I'll briefly go through some of these slides, and they are things that set the scene. So first of all, there's more people living inside that circle that you can see on the screen than outside. So what it's telling us is, and Australia is a really sparse country with only 25 million people, but we're sitting right beside an area that is the largest demographic and the fastest growing. It's also we know that the middle class is going to, and you'll see why this is important in a minute, but the middle class is going to grow dramatically in this area. And so their increase in disposable incomes is going to transfer to a lot of commodities, but they are steadily engaging in wanting to increase meat into their diets. And sheep meat is considered in these areas as a specialty meat. Almost, I had one analyst talk to me the other day and described it as the Wagyu of red meat. The sheep meat industry is an industry that supplies red meat protein into these markets, and it's considered a high value delicacy. So that's setting the scene of where we're at. This is one of the reasons why we think these trends are going to continue to play out on the demand, continue to increase demand for our sheep and lamb meat and red meat in general. So what we know is that when countries increase their income levels, and especially when they move through the levels of from 10,000 US dollars to 30,000 US dollars, the food intake of calories, protein, and fats dramatically rises. Now, we've seen that happen in the past. We've seen that happen in countries where their economies have moved from third world status into developing world and then into first world. But we've never seen it happen with the population that we're seeing move through that space at the moment. So we know that the increase for demand increases, but we also know that we've got this massive population growth, and we've got higher incomes means greater food consumption, and we've got bigger increases coming at the lower end. So if you look at those three charts I've got there, you can see that the biggest movement in that J curve is when the population moves from 5,000 US dollars disposable income per household up through 10,000 and 20,000. And that's where a lot of that is coming, that demographic is moving through right at the moment. So income up, food intake up, especially evidence in consumption increases in red meat, and the bigger increases at the lower end of the income growth rate. There's the other thing that's noticeable is that sheep meat consumption is really growing in the developing world. The developed world, and we know from probably most of the people on this conference, Melissa, are from countries that would be considered in the developed world. And we know that there's pushback on the amount of red meat that people eat in these countries. And it's probably a good reason for that. We probably eat too much. But there's a massive population in the developing world that's coming through that is very keen to add meat to their basic veggie-only diets. And so when people in Australia, quite often we have people a little bit concerned and saying, my kids have gone to the city and their friends don't eat meat, and people are saying that they don't want to eat more meat. The fortunate thing is that there is a much bigger demographic that is putting their hand up and saying, we want meat and we want to increase the amount of red meat consumption. The original point of that was that what it was doing was increasing the survivability of those populations. So as the diets improved and red meat was introduced, the kids and the population ended up with longer lives and greater survivability. But the main driver right now is the fact that they can afford to do this, and that this is the type of things that they want to do, copying to some extent what we were doing in the first world. Australia is very fortunate because we export around about 70% of what we produce. So while we eat a lot of red meat ourselves, we're only a small population. So fortunately, we export a lot. And it's interesting that we've got a really diverse set of markets out of Australia. And not only are those markets taking lamb, the lamb is going to a whole lot of different destinations, we're also breaking up the carcass, and we're sending parts of the carcass to the markets that are the most demanding or the most appropriate. The two big markets we have are the US and China. And as in percentage terms, they've been the strong performers again this year. And we know that with the pandemic, we'll talk a little bit more about how that impacted, But we know that underlying demand has been really strong. We've now got prices in Australia that are just, a few years ago would have just been dreamt about and hoped for. The challenge is, though, or one of the challenges, and this isn't the big challenge I'm going to talk about today, but one of the challenges is that our lamb and beef prices have been steadily rising over time. And if you look at, a comparative meat, chicken, and I haven't got pork there, but pork's similar, that's been kept very, very stable. So a lot of this is to the credit of the marketing authorities. So organisations like Meat and Livestock Australia have positioned our red meat, and in this case, especially our lamb and sheep meats, in areas where they can be sold as premium products, and that's resulted in increased prices and translates back to increased prices at farm gate. So talking about farm gate, it's an amazing story. Any chartist or economist that saw a chart like this would say, it's highly unusual. And what's been happening is that we've had broadly good seasonal conditions for the last 2 years, but prices are historically very strong as well. So the Eastern States Trade Lamb Indicator, which is the general lamb benchmark indicator for Australia, for Australian lamb, it has a bit of seasonality, a bit of fluctuation. You'll see in that chart, it looks like a sawtooth. And what it's really, if we drill down into that, it's telling us that in the winter, when there's not much lamb around, it's not the ideal time to be turning off lambs, the price spikes. And in the summer, in the spring and the summer, when there's a lot of lambs about, the price comes under some pressure. But what that chart's showing us is that year on year, we have higher highs in the winter and we have higher lows in the spring and the summer. And the National Mutton Indicator, which is the orange line there, which is representing the sheep meat industry, so we differentiate here between sheep meat and lamb, is following the same pattern. And so both lamb and mutton are stronger year on year. They're stronger this year than last year. And we've basically recovered. You can see there was a bit of a blip towards the middle of 2020 where we had a COVID impacts on our meat processors, and that caused a lot of concern. You can see where the green Eastern States Trade Lamb Indicator fell below the trend. But that was at a time when we had very few lambs being processed, fortunately. It was the quiet time of the year. And the meat processors got back to work really quickly. And immediately we saw that price spiked up. So the demand was there, and the processors were able to get going again, which meant, it didn't have a big impact on the lamb industry. So we've now, I think at the moment, our lamb prices are about 11% ahead of this time last year. And remembering that right now we're in the peak of the lamb turn-off season. This is the time when, most of our lambs get turned off. So the market's stronger year on year, and we've got very tight mutton supply. So for those who are, perhaps I don't want to use terms you're not familiar with, but we differentiate here our sheep meat between lambs, which generally have still got their lamb's teeth. They're designated as being lamb, and anything that hasn't got its lamb's teeth is designated as mutton and differentiated. Both very good products, but they both have different destinations, or different, I shouldn't say destinations, but different consumer uses. So while all that demand, and the reason I'm putting all that up, all that demand and the price is very strong. The challenge we have here in Australia is that the flock is at a 100-year low level. This is the lowest the flock's been for 100 years. And it's quite, I'm going to say frustrating. It's disconcerting for those people who have been in the industry for a long time and love the industry to see that we've never had better conditions, both in terms of price and now following our drought that ended in early 2020, really good seasonal conditions, and yet the flock is at a very low level. And so what my contention is that the industry will need to grow while these good seasons are around, because we know that when the droughts eventually come again, we will see another sell-off of the flock. So if you're not growing it in the good times, you will end up declining and depleting the flock over a longer term, because the tough times will see farmers sell down. The other, if you look at the black line of the on the chart there, which is the flock, and I've got behind it the breakdown of state by state, and you can see a state like Queensland, which really has had a lot of challenges. It has challenges of seasons, so droughts. It also has a unique problem in wild dogs, where the wild dogs just made it very difficult for anyone to run sheep. That in Queensland, the flock has really declined. But if you look at the black line, and we'll just briefly explain a little bit of what happened there. So in the 1950s and 60s, the flock was in a strong growth phase. We went from sort of the below 100 million and almost touched 180 million in the 60s. Then we had some tough years and some droughts, and then we went back up to those levels in the late 90s. In the late 90s, the wool price collapsed, and the returns from sheep were really impacted by the low wool prices. Remembering Australia is predominantly a merino flock, and so the value of wool coming off those sheep is a big component of a lot of sheep producers' incomes. When the wool price collapsed, farmers lost confidence in the sheep industry, and we had a steady decline in sheep numbers from 178 million, I think, heading down through 120 million. And then we started to get into the period where we had 10 years of poor seasons. Some of them were drought years, some were just poor years, and that continued that decline in the sheep flock. And that was the problem that the industry has had. It's principally been felt by merino sheep. So the merino wool production has taken a bigger hit than the sheep meat turn-off production. But in general, you can see that our flock is now at a very low level. And for those that are passionate with sheep, and for those that are in the industry making a lot of money, that's seen as a little bit of a problem. And Melissa mentioned that, this is being sponsored by sheep producers. Well, Melissa and I are both part of the sheep producers organisation. Melissa does far more work than I do, but I'm a director on the board. And part of our challenge is to say, well, we need to see a growing industry over time. We understand that there will be times when farmers just can't carry as many sheep as they want to, but over time, we want to see a growing industry, and that to me is a good sign of health. So if we look to the future, and you can see this is another chart of the flock and the forecasts. I'll just focus on the right-hand chart for a minute. One of the things we know, if you look at the right-hand chart and the red line, which is relating to sheep offtake on the right-hand side, if we're slaughtering and in Australia we live export some sheep, if we're slaughtering or exporting more than 12% of the flock is in decline. So the grey areas you can see there are the periods where where our offtake, so slaughter and export, has been below 12%. And when it's below 12%, we can grow the flock. When it's above 12%, we can't grow the flock. The flock is in decline. And you can see the periods there, the two recent periods from 2013 and 2017, 2018 were drought periods. So we know there's not much can be done about that. But we also have confidence that right now, and for some time now, our flock turnoff has been hovering around 8%, which is predicting that we will see a good recovery in the flock numbers. So 100-year flock, but we do have a strong intention to rebuild. For those few people who in Australia who are up early enough to be listening to this live, they will be able to vouch for me that this is an unprecedented season we're seeing right now. Everywhere we look, there are farmers saying that they've never seen things as good as what it is now. That on the back of what was probably 10 years of our worst drought. So while we had the decline in the flock, we now have this intention to to grow the flock. And the forecast is that there'll be a 19% growth from 2020 to 2030. Now, just to put that in, that is going to be a massive growth. And to put that in context, the last growth was only running at about 11%, which was in the last growth phase. So that's going to mean that we've got this strong increase or intention to increase in numbers, but it's going to create some challenges, and we'll get to those in a minute and how they might be dealt with. There's tighter supply, and this is MLA's forecast for slaughter heads. So you can see that this year and last year, compared to the last 10 years, we had a really contracted slaughter rate, and that was because farmers were holding back stock to rebuild the flock. The other thing just of interest in Australia is that our long-term lamb average carcass weights have been rising, quite strongly, and so we have a different lamb carcass weight and size to the other big exporting country of New Zealand. Ours are much heavier, and that means that we look for a market for that, which happens to be the US. The US loves the heavy lamb. It's just something that suits their restaurant trade and their ship cruising trade. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But that demand growth has been strong. It's interesting that you can see there that the seasonality of the tons of lambs that's gone to the US this year, there was a big surge in exports to the US in April, May, June and July. And that coincided with a lot of lambs that were held over from last year and fed on in feedlots and summer crops to meet the turnoffs in that period. While right now we have our lamb weights are at their lightest because we got the spring summer lamb coming through, and the US is back to its normal trajectory. But what it's telling us is that the US has a strong demand growth. One of the other things that's happened is that COVID has added to that demand. So we know that there are a lot of people who've some for the first time, but certainly there was more home cooking going on, and so the shopper was going down looking in the meat section. They were buying their beef one day, they were buying their pork, chicken, whatever. Oh, let's try some lamb. And so we know that a lot more lamb in the US households went back as a result of COVID. Previously, the cruise liners were and restaurants were our biggest customers out of the US, but we're expecting that this new demand coming from households will continue into the future. The other thing that's happening in the US, and I know there's a lot of people from Canada on here. I'm sorry I don't have the figures for you, but I suspect they're similar, and that is that US production has been declining from their own US sheep meat production for a long time, since the 90s. However, since early 2000s, the consumption and demand for lamb has been growing. So that has to be met by imports, and that helps explain why our lamb finds a really ready home in the US, and that we expect will continue. As I said, the COVID, or I guess encouraging people to cook at home, has meant that they've started to try these sort of things. And we know that when people try lamb, they generally are quite surprised, and it becomes part of their special purchases. So a delicacy and a meat that they consume and buy at times when things are special. So that's the US. So a very important market for our heavy lamb. The other one is China, and there's a lot of discussion about whether, especially in Australia here, we seem to be having geopolitical discussions and tensions with China. However, the reality is that China is a huge importer of meat, and that coincides with the increase in their household incomes. So they're demanding more. On this chart I have here, sheep and lamb meat doesn't feature, only because it's so small. But the red meat demand is trading off across to our lamb and sheep meats. that demand kicked off in sort of after 2010, where the Chinese population really started to have some disposable incomes in their households, and they directed towards red meat. Then we had the African swine fever. It's still a contributing factor, but as we all know with China, they really do roll their sleeves up and get things sorted out. This is their latest piggeries they're building. So they will, replace a lot of that pork that was taken out of the equation because of African swine fever very quickly. However, we know that the demand for Australian sheep and lamb meat wasn't driven by the African swine fever. It was probably turbocharged by that. And so that underlying demand is going to support it. I just want to quickly give you an update on the wool market. And for a lot of people, you'll be not very familiar with the wool market. Our wool indicators have recovered from COVID. You can see we really got hit hard when China was first impacted by COVID. The mills were just closed. People couldn't trade. But that's essentially recovered, and the market has had a really steady result this year. The other thing that happens here is that we have a lot of fine microns. So 17 micron compared to 21 micron. You can see the periods where the prices were very low. So we're talking here about the premium of 17 micron over 21 micron. And for those who aren't familiar with what a micron is actually 1/1,000,000th of a metre. So 17 micron wool, you can imagine, is a very fine fibre and a very special fibre. We have quite a bit of it in Australia, but when we have a drought, because the sheep are starved of protein, the sheep that are normally 21 micron end up having a finer fleece. And what was happening is we were flooding the market at that time, and you can see the premiums dropped away. But we're pretty much back to the market's back. However, our production is declining. Was lost ground to crops, as Melissa mentioned at the start. Sheep has lost ground to crops, but specifically it's been wool sheep that have lost ground to crops. The reason that we can't separate the merino sheep from the meat sheep in Australia in terms of impact is because so many of our slaughter numbers, our lambs, come from merino sheep one way or another. So maintaining that merino flock is vital, not just for the wool industry, but also for our sheep meat production. Fine wool was oversupplied. We talked about that, but now the numbers are stabilising and fine wool will fall. Now, to get to the point of my discussion, I guess today, with all that long background, is one of the things we know is that there's a direct correlation between the amount of hectares that are planted to crop and the population of the sheep flock. So in 1990-91, we had 160 million sheep, and we were planting about 14 million hectares of winter crop. Most of the crops in Australia are winter crops. They're planted in the autumn and early winter, and they grow through and are harvested in the early summer. If you move forward, though, to 2021, and you can see those green dots on the right-hand side of that scale, we've now got a much larger hectares of winter crop. So we're over 20 million hectares, and our sheep flock has declined correspondingly. So the relationship is very strong. So the question is, how and why did grain win that fight for acres? Because when we look at the economics of cropping, winter cropping versus sheep, there isn't a lot of difference over the longer period. There's no difference really over the longer period in terms of the returns to the farmer. You know, farmers have good years and bad years for prices for meat and wool and grains, and the season impacts probably more severely on a grain grower than a sheep producer. So it wasn't an economic decision that was made. There were other decisions that were made that pushed these farmers to decide that they were going to plant more crops on their farms at the expense of sheep. And we've been a little bit disappointed, I suppose, that it wasn't a an economic decision. It was for other reasons. And the main reason was that the competition, if you like, or the cropping industry changed their systems dramatically. This is the competition that the sheep industry is up against. So the farmer's son or daughter who comes back from agriculture college is able to get into very modern, innovative cropping systems and scale up. You might have noticed that there's a lot of discussion these days in Australia about finding, and I guess everywhere in the world, about finding staff to work in agriculture. One of the ways that the cropping industry has dealt with that is that they've embraced the innovation and technology that's allowed them to scale up. And I speak to ag colleges quite often, students, and people say, oh, they just want to go home and drive tractors. But if you said to them they're going to go home and lift up a 3-bushel bag of wheat 500 times a day, they probably wouldn't be so keen. However, in the sheep industry, that's what we still do. We still lift up that 3-bushel bag of wheat. We still do things in a way that requires a lot of labour. And so that need to innovate is going to continue to become a more and more important and essential implication into the industry if we're going to actually keep our share of the acres. So, I've spent time doing both of these tasks, drenching sheep and shearing sheep. And it's difficult to see that in the future we will have generations of people who will be prepared to do this. So we'll have to embrace changes to this. It's happening. It's slow progress. Not many people would know this, but one of the frustrations is that the sheep industry hasn't stuck with innovation or ideas. In 1990, this robot shore a sheep in 6 minutes. Now, and I noted on the article that the scientists here were saying that they thought within a period of time that they would be able to get the sheep to be shorn in a couple of minutes. Now, this was in 1990, and so the technology was quite amazing, to be honest. And remembering that the iPhone was only launched publicly in 2007. So the advancement in computers since the 1990s has been massive. But we were able to shear a sheep in 1990. The problem was that back then, and I was reading the article, the Australian Workers Union representative said, oh, look, we don't really need to worry about that. We have plenty of people to do the job, and we can do it quicker and more efficiently, and we can keep people employed. Unfortunately, we're now at a stage where getting the sheep shorn is one of the biggest challenges that farmers have here in Australia now. And so now we're scrambling to try and replicate what's happened. All that technology with the sheep that was, with the robot that shore those sheep, unfortunately has been lost, can't be found. So we've sort of missed the opportunity from 1990 to now, which is 30 years of technology and development. And we're now at a stage where we're saying, hang on, we're short of labour. It's difficult to get people to do this hard work. What are we going to do? Well, it's already happening. The sheep handling, the general conditions of farming are being addressed, especially while we've got, a very profitable period. It's not happening universally, though. And I go back to the cropping. The cropping people were able to, so the farmers who were at the cutting edge, the early adopters, they were able to test the innovations and test the things like, the new machinery, the no-till systems, the GPS systems, but it very quickly rolled out to all farmers. So very quickly, that information was rolled out to all farmers, probably via the agronomists. Whereas with the sheep industry, we do have farmers who have the very good sheep handling systems, but we do also still have a lot of the majority of farmers in terms of numbers. So the majority of farms are still back in the days when it was hard work. And the other thing is the innovation in shearing. We now and this photo I put up here for you now is a backpacker, and Abe was employed by this farmer. They set up a platform. He'd never shot a sheep before, but within a very short period of time, he was able to be an effective shearer in the industry, and the whole thing was a bit of a science experiment to say, well, look, if we're going to address this labour problem, address this issue of how do we handle sheep and how do we get the sheep treated, whether it's with animal husbandry or whether it's at shearing time, we're going to have to think outside the square. And this particular farmer built this system where he said, look, I'm only going to employ people who aren't shearers, people who aren't professionals, to prove a point. And so Abe was one of his star recruits. And it was great to see that these things can happen. What the challenge will be for the future, though, is rolling out this innovation not to the farmers who are at the cutting edge, but across the whole industry. Because if we don't do that, it'll be the farmers who are at the farmers who aren't innovation driven, who will suddenly say, this is all too hard, and it's probably going to be easier for me to go back and plant a crop and put in some big machinery, or even hand the farm over to somebody else who's going to do that. So the challenge for us as a sheep industry is to find ways to allow people to grow their flocks. The incentive is there right now. The passion is there. The markets are there. The demand is there, as I showed you before. And the demand into the future is there. The challenge will be: can we find ways to look after these sheep, to manage these sheep, just like the cropping industry did, to manage these sheep in a more technological and a more less labour than what we've done in the past. Now, Melissa, that's the end of my presentation. As we said, I'd be very happy to engage in a conversation or a discussion, and I'm taking the opportunity to put up an advert for our Commodity Conversations podcast and Mikado's information if anybody would like to engage down the track.
Thank you so much, Robert. And I will also give a shout out to the podcast. There's some really interesting information on there, certainly an Australian slant, but also a wide range of topics, not just on sheep, but across all commodities. So a well put together program with your team with those commodity conversations. Thank you so much, Robert, for sharing that. There's been a few questions and interaction in the chat throughout your talk. So I just wondered if anyone would like to unmute yourself, feel free to raise your hand, give us a wave and ask a question directly, or as other people have been doing, continue to put some more questions through the chat. But Robert, thank you so much for sharing the data and the information, but also the insight and your perspectives around that. It's really valuable. So any questions from the floor? Give us a wave. So some of the comments that have come through the chat, Robert, were around, in comparing your fight for acres, were around how does the impact of crops being more insurable than sheep, how would that impact this conversation?
More insurable, Melissa?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I think I've got to actually disagree, because I think sheep are more insurable than crops. So the biggest challenge for Australian agriculture, and agriculture and Canada's just felt this, is the season. So in a drought year in Australia, our sheep can survive. We just can't carry as many of them. We can actually maintain our core flocks. But a crop, we've had crops in the last droughts where, the crops were planted, the fertiliser was put in, and there was nothing returned. So it on a year-by-year basis, the crops are a bigger disaster in a bad year than sheep. But what happens with crops, though, is that you can actually very quickly get back in. You can plant a crop and in 5 months you're harvesting again, with good seasonal conditions. Whereas with sheep, and cattle for that matter in Australia, it's a longer term herd and flock build. So we don't have revenue insurance for our crops here in Australia, whereas in the US, I'm not sure about Canada, but in the US, they can insure their crops against price fall, poor yields, etc. We can only insure ours against hail and storm damage. And, you know, a lot of farmers take that insurance out, but in the end, that's not the thing that really determines their returns. It's whether or not the rains come at the right time.
Okay. And we've also had a question come through around a little bit more on COVID impacts locally to get a perspective in Australia. It's a question coming through from Canada. So what has been the impacts in your view across agriculture in the COVID times? Sorry,
could you just start that question again, please?
What have been the COVID impacts across Australian agriculture?
Yes, not much. I mean, the farming community really just farmed along without any real impacts to them, to their day-to-day activities. We were very concerned at one point because the processing, sheep and lamb processing, most of it, 50% of sheep and lamb processing is done in Victoria. So that's in the southeast corner of Australia. And some of those plants were closed for a short period of time because of COVID. As I said, it happened at a time when we didn't have many lambs coming through. It was the quiet time of the year, but also to the credit of the industry, they really quickly got their processes in place. We had none of the disasters that like the US had, where the US had, you know, just a bank up of animals that couldn't be slaughtered. That didn't happen here. The biggest challenge we probably have from COVID is that some of the meatworks have had less backpackers moving around, and they usually use those backpackers to ramp up their staffing levels at the peak season. So, you know, they're probably running slightly below capacity, but because we've got such a good season here, the pressure to turn off lambs and cattle for that matter is not great on the farmers. So they can hold stock back a bit and spread it through the system as you know, the capacity is able to absorb it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions for Robert? We've got a feedback from Michael on the chat is that Revan insurance in the USA is not currently available.
Okay, well, that's interesting because I know Australian grain growers look at those revenue insurance products the US has had and with a lot of envy, and there's a lot of discussion about how they can try and implement them here. I just want to comment, Melissa, if I can, on the comment from Miles about no longer thinking that lamb prices are high. I think I tend to agree with you, Miles. I think with the positioning of lamb, and I think the credit is a lot to do with Australia and New Zealand marketing organisations. The positioning of lamb has been really successful, and we know that as consumers have increased incomes and an increased capacity to purchase, they are prepared to spend more money on premium products. And so the challenge for Australia is to continue to produce a premium product, and Australia and New Zealand, because I mean, we are the major exporters of sheep and lamb meat into the world. It's to continue to produce a premium product, and it's also to continue to produce a safe and a product that gives the consumer a lot of confidence. So the biosecurity systems that Australia has in place now are absolutely contributing to that premium price, and I think it has changed the game. You know, people can look at the Australian and New Zealand product, I should say, and say that product is a premium product, and I have a lot of confidence in that. Therefore, the question about whether I'm prepared to pay more per kilogram of protein than I will for chicken or pork or whatever is not such a defined question. So the continued efforts of Australian farmers and the industry, and New Zealand farmers and their industry, in improving the product, delivering it in a safe and a way that has a lot of integrity. The provenance stories that are being told, they're all adding value to this. And so I think, I'm inclined to agree with you, Miles, that we're looking at a different paradigm for prices. Did you have any comment, Miles? I can actually see you there. I'm interested in your.
Okay.
Yeah.
I took my microphone off there. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. And I'm glad to contribute. Okay, in terms of pricing, yes, I guess my knowledge here, the paradigm shift started with, I guess, the Renewable Fuels Act, and we've seen mass inflation in terms of corn prices, probably because we're burning food for fuel here. So I was always looking for the other side of the coin to shift, and that was an inflation of meat prices. But it's taken a while, and I think that we're in that game here, and I don't discount it. I think it's a good thing that meat prices had to come up with the inflation of our costings. So, but yeah, no, I think that as soon as people go to the counter and look for meat, and obviously there's a lot of comparison and pricing. I think beef has done a great thing for the lamb and the mutton sectors there. So I don't think being leader in price is a great thing to a certain extent, because a lot of market people are price sensitive. But that's where I'm coming from here. So in terms of insurance, I know Manitoba, I know insurance programs vary across Canada. We do have yield insurance for pastures and so on, and dairy is a big uptake to it, but it's a good way for producers to insure. We also have different products, but they're more of an income guarantee program or guarantee income programming. It's called agri-insurance. So producers do use that types of programming. I wouldn't discount the opportunity to use private insurance. I think programs can be developed. There is a company in Manitoba called Farmer's Edge. They're the leaders in digital agriculture. Use satellite systems. They're back-based with a Brazilian insurance company and so on. But maybe the industry needs to develop their own insurance programs on a private side, and not necessarily be too lenient on government doing all the work on private insurance for them to mitigate risk. I know for crops like soybeans, Manitoba never grew soybeans. We wouldn't touch it until we got insurance in place. And now we got about 1 million acres out of the 10 million of cultivable acres there. So insurance does mean a lot to many, because if you take the risk 100%, the banks don't like it. If you can mitigate some of that risk, that helps out with the financing and so on. So anyways, what I'm saying is the sheep industry should look at private insurance to get some of the products that would help them advance in the future.
Thanks, Miles. I just comment on the prices, going back to commodity prices. We, in the global financial crisis, I mean, Australia's, a throwaway line is Australia's a lucky country. Well, we've been absolutely the luckiest country, because in the global financial crisis, China supported Australia through with a mining boom. And at that time, what China was doing was developing its manufacturing capacity to try and lift the GDP of the Chinese household. And so a lot of people in China moved into work in those factories, where suddenly they were getting, incomes that were allowing them to do some of the things that they were seeing happening in the rest of the world. Then, but it was interesting at the time, and I had somebody say, what comes after a mining boom is a dining boom. And I remember discussing this with a group of farmers one day, and they were relatively pessimistic, saying, well, that probably won't translate to our farm gates. But that's exactly what's happening right now. Now, whether it's the dining boom that's following the mining boom, or whether it's just food inflation, or whether it's just evolution, it doesn't really matter. The reality is that we're now in times of extraordinary opportunity for our farmers. It doesn't mean there's not challenges. I mean, the most recent challenge that's coming is fertilizer prices, which has got a whole lot of another complete discussion behind what's driving that. But the opportunity for that agriculture is now being recognised as a much more vital component of economies, and Australia and New Zealand, these large agriculture producing countries, large exporting countries, are getting the benefit of that, and to some degree that explains why our economies have been so resilient. So it's unlikely that that's going to change. Population will keep growing. There are now, the average wealth of the population is now greater than it's ever been, and the technology and communication, or the ability for people to understand what's available in different parts of the world, is as it's never been, as we know. Look at us today. So we've got this. Australia and New Zealand are sitting on the edge of the Asian, explosion, if you like. But the next one that coming will be, it'll continue to come, whether that's, in the Middle East and Africa. These large populations are all engaging in ways to improve their lifestyle and improve their children's survivability chances. Red meat and sheep meat is really just a little tag on. We just catch onto the coattails of it. Red meat will continue to play a really important part in that market. Thank you, Melissa.
Fantastic. Thank you. And there's another one here in the chat for you, Robert, from Steve. Is the flock rebuild coming from merinos or other maternals, composite shedders? Where are you seeing it?
Very good question. Can you tell me where Steve's from?
Steve, I think is it Steve Australia, or have we got a different Steve? Steve.
So the Australian flock has traditionally, if you look at matings, it's always been above 75% of ewes mated has been to merinos. So that tells you where the original focus for the Australian sheep was. This year, the latest MLA figures I think it's the matings to merinos has dropped below 75% for the first time ever. And that's a trend it's following, I guess it's following the money. When you've got a sheep that can produce wool as its primary product, and some sheep meat as a secondary product, versus an animal that can produce meat as its primary product and wool as its secondary product, people are choosing the sheep meat. So we've got more sheep being mated to terminal size. We've got more sheep being mated to composites. We've even got a growing trend of people mating their ewes to rams that don't produce any wool, so shedding sheep, and that's a new an emerging trend. I think it gets quite a bit of focus here. I think the numbers are still very small, but if we continue to see the challenges with getting sheep shorn, in some areas it's almost, it's a real challenge, and you would all know that in Australia we have this terrible fly that attacks the sheep in the summer. So you have to get your sheep shorn or crutched or whatever to keep them healthy. If that's not possible, then farmers are going to make decisions more and more to shift to these shedding sheep. But the increase in the flock that we talked about is not coming from merino sheep. So the wool industry has a challenge, has a real an issue ahead of itself, but the sheep meat industry is probably in a better space in Australia.
Wonderful. Well, we might wrap it up there with questions, and thank you once again, Robert, for all of your insights and information. Really valuable contribution to the program, and we appreciate it so very much to have you on board today.